morning. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you to the St. Rest Sunday School for July 5th. I hope you had a prosperous and a safe 4th of July and you enjoyed the celebrations that you were able to. We have a wonderful lesson prepared for you today, and I hope that you can look at it in the spirit that we give it and take something that's going to help you get through the week. Today we're going to look at the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and the book of Esther. I have objectives that I want you to get from this lesson simply because to me the lesson is more than talking about what happened 2,000 years ago. This Bible is speaking to us through these lessons right now at this time with words of wisdom that we can use to help us get through our daily lives. The first objective we want to let you know is God is at work throughout the world. Even he worked through a pagan king. So that tells us it doesn't matter who's in the White House. It doesn't matter who's in the governor's mansion. It doesn't matter who's sitting at the top of our office that we go to work in every day. God can use anyone to accomplish his purpose, and we will see that throughout these 3 books today. He used it for Ezra, he used it for Nehemiah, and he also used it for Esther. The second objective we want to get from this lesson is human work is successful when God blesses the work. Sometimes we want to go out and it's all about what I did, but we don't do anything without God. Through God, all things are possible. Without God, we can't do anything. And the minute we realize that and we ask God to bless and direct our work, we will find out our work will be successful. The third thing we want to get from this lesson is sometimes trusting God means not relying on human help. And take me for an example. Whenever I hit an issue, the first thing I want to do is run to my neighbor and ask him before I consult God. And of course, he has an answer, and I can't tell you the result of those answers. But if you go to God and you have the patience to wait on him, the answer will come, and it will be the right answer. The fourth illustration from this lesson, it is an illusion to think that power, position, or wealth insulate us from the hazards of life. We look at what's going on right now, and it doesn't matter how much money you got, COVID-19 is taking people. It doesn't matter whether you're rich, whether you're poor, you can be a senator, you can be in the White House, it doesn't matter. Power, position, wealth, you can't escape the hazards of life. The COVID-19 doesn't look at your bank account and decides this is the one I'm going to take or not take. It doesn't look, what you got in your refrigerator, what type of house you live in. So wealth and prosperity cannot insulate you. The fifth objective from this lesson, the only way to serve God is to acknowledge that we cannot control the outcome of actions. Sometimes we want to say, I did it my way. But as Christians, we got to learn that we can only do it when we say we did it God's way. God is in control. And once we acknowledge that we're going to have to wait on him for our directions, we're not going to be successful at whatever we do. Let's look at some important facts about Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And what we're going to do with this lesson, we're going to look at summaries of the 3 books. And then as we move toward the end, we will give you some bits and pieces and break down individual things within each book specifically. So when we look at Ezra and Nehemiah, what we talk about is, think about your workplace. Most Christians don't find their workplace very supportive of their faith. I go to work every day, and sometimes I don't want to talk about my faith because people don't want to hear it. And then you feel like an outcast when you stand up for Jesus. But you will find out these 3 people, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, were in a foreign land, and they were used by God to take God's will direction. Generally, there's a limited scope of explicitity when Christian witness. We don't want to witness like we should. There are times that I see things and I want to turn my head because I'm afraid to stand up for Christ. But that's not what God called us to do. God called us to be bold and stand up. It's sometimes you could see sin as bold. people would come right out and they would declare, and sometimes we as Christians, we shrink in the face of sin when we should be standing up and confronting sin. And if we have Christ within us, that should not be a chore or a task for us to do. Moreover, workers may feel pressured or violated when I talk to Christ about them. How do you handle that? Well, we got to stand by the biblical standards, either explicitly or the implied standards. We cannot let people dictate who we are. If we stand for Christ, it is important that we dictate who we are to them and we stand up for what's right. So since we live in a pluralistic society, some limits may be appropriate in the workplace, but some limits in our workplace make us feel like we are in alien territory, just like Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. But even though they were in a foreign territory, they still recognized who the true and living God is. The book of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther depict what it's like for people to work in unwelcoming places. They were slaves. They were in captivity. They were under direction of, foreign nations. But they did not forget the true and living God was in control, even though they were in dire circumstances. Can you just imagine being in captivity? You are a slave, but you are praising God through your circumstances as they were. And then we'll find out that God allowed them to do great works for him. These three people show that God is working through people. No matter what your job is, God can work through people, whether it's construction, whether it's politics, whether it's entertainment, whether you're in a hostile environment. God is still in control and God is working through people. And yet along the way, you'll find out that non-believers were the ones that helped these three people accomplish God's will. And if you can only imagine, we say we believe in Christ and we believe in God and we do little, but just look at these lessons, how God used non-believers to accomplish his purpose. And these people were in the highest position. They didn't have to. They were kings, but God used them to accomplish his will. So God's power seems to crop up for his people in good and surprising places. In extremely challenging situations or circumstances, God is always there. And we can agree with that. Now let's look at Ezra. Ezra had to ponder whether to trust in an unbelieving ruler to protect the Jewish people as they returned to Jerusalem, or whether to trust in God. The king wanted to send soldiers with him. And Ezra is saying, if I tell people God is my protector, what is it going to look like if I'm dependent on these soldiers? So he prayed about it, he fasted, and he prayed, and his answer was to take this journey without the help of the king's soldiers. On the other hand, when we look at Nehemiah, Nehemiah was the opposite. He was returning to Jerusalem, and the king offered his assistance to soldiers to get them through the land. Nehemiah accepted that help. What's the difference? Is it one way wrong or one way right? No. What this is showing us that God can accomplish his will and his purpose through many different reasons. He doesn't have to have one way. When we get one way, we limit what God can do. We just have to accept what he sends and make it work for us, realizing that if it's God's will, his will will be accomplished. Now, Ezra went back. His mission was to rebuild the temple. And that is important because if you look at why the people ended up in captivity in the first place, because they disobeyed God. So God is getting a place, so once he restored them, that they can go ahead and again worship him the way they should. And God is saying, I put you in captivity. It's my intent that you will live and prosper in the land that I have given you, so I'm going to make it easy for you to do. So Ezra's mission was to rebuild that temple. Now, as Nehemiah went back, his mission, and it was later when he returned to Jerusalem, and his mission was to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. So he had a specific mission. And once the temple was built, what better way than to secure it with the walls? And you think about in today's time, we don't have walls around our city, but we have walls around our churches, and that's important because can you imagine if we didn't have walls and the equipment and the furniture we had was just sitting out in the open? I guarantee you, you would go home on Sunday and you would come back the next Sunday, and nothing would be there. That's no different than it was then. So both missions were important. One provided a place to worship. One provided security for the people to worship in. Now, once we look at Esther had to survive both oppression of women and being a slave in Persia. And if you think about it, those days, women had little or no voice anyway, but Esther rose to be a leader to save her people from genocide. Our titles and institutions have changed. We're no longer in captivity, but in many places today, we are still acting as if we are in Babylon. We need Esther, we need Nehemiah, and we need Ezra to come and labor to guide us through. Real life situations and challenges found these biblical books, they help develop theological matters, and that's what we need to be about. And theological matters is just saying, as Christians, we need to be about our Father's business. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah, that starts around the time frame 587 BC in Babylon under the king Nebuchadnezzar, who conquered Jerusalem. As we mentioned earlier, when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem, he conquered Jerusalem. He came in, he killed the leaders, he ransacked the temple, took everything of value out, and then he burned it to the ground. And then he destroyed the walls around the city. And he took the best and the brightest people of that nation and took them back to Babylon in captivity. And he just left the scrubs and the scrap, but he left them to nothing. They had to fend for themselves with nothing. The food was gone, the wall was gone, the houses was gone. So what he left, it didn't matter whether you live or die. But he took the best and the brightest and he used them in his kingdom. But what he didn't know, as he was using them, God was using him. So as we move forward, they were there for decades in exile, and in exile they were always hoping for their return, that God will restore Israel. And I can't remember the scripture, but it's there, and it quotes, "On the shores of Babylon we wept, and we thought about the Lord's land. Those that had us in captivity and laid waste to us required of us a song." And we were saying, how can I sing the Lord's song in a strange land? So they wanted to go home. They were in a strange land, and that's just telling us how they longed for the land that they were in. God did restore them, and it started with Ezra going back. Their hopes were heightened in 539 BC when Persia, led by King Cyrus, overthrew Babylon. So Babylon overthrew Jerusalem, and at time, King Cyrus and Persia overthrew Babylon. Shortly thereafter, Cyrus issued a decree inviting the Jews in his kingdom to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, their life as God's people. So Cyrus, who was a pagan king, invited the Jews to return to Jerusalem, and that was led by Ezra. Their purpose is not simply to describe what happened. The purpose of this lesson, we don't want to talk about what happened back then. We need to look at the historical events, and they relate to us restoration. That's what it's all about. And when we think about restoration, that is what Christ offered to us, restoration. We were separated. The children of Israel were separated from Jerusalem. They were captivity in Babylon. Then God offered restoration starting with Ezra. We were separated from God by the nature of our sin. Christ was sent to the cross to give us that restoration and a way back. So that was our way of getting back to our homeland through Jesus Christ. And that's what the theme of those books about, restoration, getting back to God, getting back to basics. And it started with the building, a rebuilding of the temple. These books show God once restored his people and how God played a central role in that renewal. This wasn't done because of the people. This was all done because of God's plan of salvation to return his people. Christ just didn't go to the cross. That was God's plan of salvation so that we could get back to God. All that restoration that's being taught in Ezra, Nehemiah, is being shown to us today by what God did for us by sending his son to die on the cross to restore us and give us a right to what we say the tree of life. Ezra and Nehemiah were written by unknown authors, probably in the 4th century BC, and they were written to encourage the Jewish people to live faithfully under foreign rule. And as I think about it, when I was in college, sometimes away from my parents, I would forget everything that I was taught. I wanted to be like everybody else. I wanted to party just as hard, and Saturday night at home, my dad would say, Saturday night, you get ready for Sunday school that Sunday morning, and that was driven into us. Then when I got from under them, I'm going to be like everybody else. If they're going to party and drink on Saturday night, guess what? I'm not going to be in my room thinking about Sunday school. But this lesson is telling us, as Christians, we have standards. And as I grew older, I knew better that you cannot change your standards. God has standards for his people, and we are required to maintain those standards no matter where you are. These people are in captivity, but God didn't say, because you're in captivity, I'm going to change my standards or allow you to be someone else you're not. You are called to be God's people, and captivity, you are still called to be God's people, and that's the message to Christians. No matter where we are, whether it's on our jobs, whether it's in our school, whether we are by ourselves, we are called to be God's people, and we are called to live by God's standards. Now, when we look at Esther, Esther tells a different story than Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra, when we look at the book of Esther, we talk about, first of all, a woman. And Esther does not focus on the book of restoration. It rather telling us what happened during the events in Persia while Nehemiah and Ezra are back rebuilding the walls in Jerusalem. Esther had to sacrifice herself, give up her virginity to save her people from genocide. But once she realized that God had put her there for that specific purpose, then she fell in and it worked to God's plan. Now, we talk about theology, and when you look at Nehemiah and Ezra, we're talking about God. God is mentioned, and God is all through the book. But when you read the book of Esther, you'll find out the word God or the name of God is not mentioned anywhere in that book. But you cannot read that book without seeing God at work in that book. That tells us sometimes you can't see. We cannot look with the natural eye sometimes. We got to learn to walk by faith and not by sight, because God is at work, and sometimes we can't see it because we are looking with the natural eye. Even though the name of God is not mentioned in the book of Esther, there is no way you can see that God was not at work, because the things that were accomplished and saving his people. And that's what it was all about. That's a man named Haman, who was a servant of the king, wanted to wipe out the whole nation. God put Esther there just for that purpose, so that his people would be saved. Just as he sent Christ to the cross for his people, so that we would be saved. As we move forward, his broader concern of these books, we want to examine how to thrive in exile. And we're not in exile now, but we live among unclean people. Sometimes when you walk out, I think you can identify more sinners than you can Christians. And believe it or not, we want to blend in with them. But these books are showing us this is how to survive in a world where you seem like you may not fit. The Israelites did not fit in captivity, but God managed to allow them to thrive. And at the appointed time, he returned them to their homeland. As we move forward, let's look at the book of Ezra. Now, Ezra's mission was to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. That was his one specific purpose. The book of Ezra begins with a decree from King Cyrus of Persia, allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple that had been destroyed by the Babylonians. And as we mentioned earlier, they destroyed not only the temple, everything. The introduction of this decree is specified and was proclaimed in Ezra 1:1. And I will read that for you. Ezra 1:1. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and also to put it in writing. So what we're hearing here is the Lord moved on the heart of a pagan god. So if you look at the analysis, Jerusalem conquered by Babylon. Babylon had their foot on Jerusalem's neck. The Lord said, enough is enough. He sends Cyrus and the Persian Empire, and they conquer Babylon, put their foot on Babylon's neck, and then God begins to work through Cyrus to get his people restored back to the land that he had taken them from. As we move forward, what this is showing us, the relationship between God's work and human work. God is working through humans, and sometimes we can't even see it. God is working through pagan. He took pagan kings. Cyrus made that proclamation that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished because the Lord stirred up the spirit. None of us can stir up the spirit of the man. That's God's part. Our part is to do what we can because these are the hands that God used. These are the eyes that God used. This is the mouth that God used. So we say we can't see God's hands. Yes, we can. If we do what he's commanding us to do, we're using them to build his kingdom. They're God's hands. So we need to commit ourselves to service, our whole body to God, just as these prophets did. God would do his part. He would work on the heart as he worked on the heart of those pagan people. Then it's time for us to do our part, which is to use what God has given us to upbuild his kingdom and restore our people. These are lessons, don't forget, lessons about restoration. Cyrus was doing his work as king and didn't realize in the interim that he was doing God's work on the side. And that's how God works sometimes. We can't see it. We don't recognize it. But that tells us we don't know who God is using and we don't know how. We just got to be ready and open to what our mission is when God calls upon us. We sense in the first verse that Ezra that God is in control. Yet he's working through human beings, even through a Gentile king to accomplish his mission. And sometime in the workplace, we got to look. It doesn't matter. We got to trust that God is in control in places that we're not in control in. You know, I can't tell my boss what to do, but God can. And if it's in God's will, he's going to do the right thing. As Christians, we need to learn to turn it over to Jesus. These people, no matter whether they're in the White House, the Senate, the Congress, the governor's mansion, and the mayor's office, turn it over to God. He can work through them to accomplish his mission. Cyrus was God's chosen instrument, whether or not he recognized it himself. Cyrus didn't even know God, but he was God's chosen instrument to restore God's people back to Jerusalem. Similarly, the actions of our bosses, co-workers, whether it's our customers, our rivals, regulators, and other actions, they may come against us, and God can use them just the same way. The Bible tells us in a way, you know, God will make your enemies your footstool, and that's just saying God can use anybody to accomplish his purpose through anything. And that should prevent us from despair and arrogance. So when people are down on you and you can't see your way out, don't get down on yourself. The patience, wait on God, and let God work it out for you. So if Christian people and values seem absent from any place you are, don't despair. God is still there. And we don't know who he's working in, but he can accomplish his purpose through anybody and through anything. On the other hand, if you're tempted to see yourself or your organization as a paragon of Christian virtue, beware. God may be accomplishing more through those people that we feel don't know him than we realize. We got to move back and allow God to do his work. If we allow God to do his work and we do what he's assigned us to do, we cannot help but thrive, as we will find out the Jews did. Certainly God worked through Cyrus, who remained wealthy. He didn't take Cyrus' wealth from him. He remained powerful. And then one of the most important things that we overlook, Cyrus was unbelieving. So even while he was unbelieving, God used him to accomplish his purpose. God can accomplish anything through anyone, no matter how high, low, what their status is. as we move forward, Ezra describes several efforts to squelch the construction. Now, what we find out, Ezra went back, he was on his mission, he was rebuilding that temple. What happens when things seem to be going good? There's always somebody, and these were not so much enemies from the outside, these were people on the inside. They decided, we don't want the temple bill. We don't want the temple bill. So they came out, and then there was the discouragers. And you guess what? They were so discouraged that they shut the operation down. Why would you think so? Well, sometimes we need to, as Christians, examine our own motive. People have selfish motives. You know, I'm being able to rob the poor. So I don't want this here. I don't want them to know about God. As long as I keep them ignorant and in the dark, then I got the upper hand on them. But people within, I'm speaking of the Jewish, the neighbors, and people around, even the close friends, they came in and they tried to shut the operation down and go against, and what they didn't realize, this plan was ordained by God. So they're not fighting Ezra, they're fighting God's plan. And you got to be a fool if you know God and you think that you can outwit him. God's plan and his will be accomplished. Even though these people were successful for a while at stopping the temple project, and God wasn't sleeping, it's something God allowed them to do. And you will find this in Ezra 4:24 is where that's brought out. And I read that for you. Ezra 4:24. Thus the work of the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. They shut it down, came to a standstill. Now here you have people on a God-ordained mission trying to do the work of God, and the people who should have been supporting shut it down, and as the scripture said, came to a standstill until a time. Finally, God encouraged the Jews through the prophecies of Haggai and Zechariah to resume and complete the job. And the scripture doesn't say, but I can imagine Ezra was so discouraged. God used Zechariah and Haggai to complete the work. And then sometimes, you try so hard, and people that should be encouraging you push you so far down, and you may feel like Ezra, I'm giving this thing up. Just let it go. And Lord, if you sent me here to do it, why am I struggling so? But God always says they had a ram in the bush. So on the scene comes Haggai and Zechariah, and they resumed and they completed the temple. You'll find this in the 5th chapter of Ezra, verses 1 and 2. And I have those verses if you will look at those. Ezra 5:1. Now Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, a descendant of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of God of Israel, who was over them, supporting them. So God was with Haggai and Zechariah also. And the second verse, then Zerubbabel, some say Zerubbabel, some pronounce it Zerubbabel, it doesn't matter. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, son of Jozadak, set to work to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem. And the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. So God came back in force. He said, my will. So he got Zechariah, he got Haggai, then he got Zerubbabel and Jozadak. And so he bring in you're not going to stop my will. And they didn't. And that temple was completed. Moreover, Darius, the king of Persia, underwrote the building effort financially. So money was pouring in and everything. So once the enemies came out, it said, step back and watch God work. Because the money began to flow. And this is foreign money coming in, but it was accomplishing God's purpose. Now, as we look at the book of Nehemiah, the temple was completed. Then we move to the book of Nehemiah, which has 13 chapters. The first chapter in the book of Nehemiah introduces the book bearing his name, and a residence of Susa, the capital of Persia, is where he was. When Nehemiah heard the walls of Jerusalem were still broken down more than a half century after the completion, the temple had been rebuilt. This is a half century later. Nehemiah is sitting there, and he's sitting down saying, boy, Time has gone by. The temple is out there bare. So he began to weep. But more than weeping, Nehemiah did something else. Nehemiah fasted and he prayed. So that's telling us sometimes we want to weep and feel sorry for ourselves when we should get on our knees and start consulting the Lord and waiting on his direction, because the Lord answered Nehemiah's prayer. So Nehemiah wasn't just weeping and feeling bad. He was formulating a plan and a remedy to take care of the situation. Sometimes we want to see it and we want to walk by. But as Christians, we need to see and we need to react. Nehemiah 1:4. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and I fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. So he not only wept and did nothing, he fasted and he prayed, and the Lord answered his prayer. Nehemiah prayed God to use him to save the city. Use me to be an instrument to help upbuild your kingdom. How many of us, like Isaiah, here am I, send me, I'm available. We're going to have to learn to stand up and make ourselves available for God to use. God will use you if you make yourself available to him. God accepted the prayer of Nehemiah, and he softened the heart of the Persian king. This king was Artaxerxes, who not only permitted Nehemiah to return, but he gave him supplies and accompanied him with soldiers. And one thing I've just mentioned about Nehemiah was a cupbearer. So he had a high position. He was the one that checked the king's wine and everything to make sure it was okay before he gave it to the king. So he was close to the king. And when he wept, he had a sad countenance about him. And Nehemiah was sad around the king, which tells you God was in the plan, because if you're sad and you're not jovial around the king, off with your head. So he was taking a chance, and the king had so much respect for the man of God that he asked him, Nehemiah, why are you so sad? What's bothering you? That was the concern the king had. Nehemiah explained, I'm thinking about my home city, and it's in ruins. We got the temple built and the walls are laid waste. And the king was so moved, not by Nehemiah, but by God once again stirring Artaxerxes' heart to allow him to go back, and he allowed him to go back, sent supplies with him, and sent an armed guard to make sure he got there. What we find out, as we compared earlier, when Ezra returned, the king offered him armed guard, but Ezra refused. Nothing wrong with that, because he was a prophet and he understood. He was saying, if I say God is my protector, then I'm going to depend on God to protect me. So he was a prophet, and he had this closer walk. He was a priest, and he had this walk and relationship with God. Nehemiah was in a high position, but he might have not had the same relationship. So it doesn't matter. But he realized that it was a blessing from God for him to be allowed to be escorted back. So he was grateful that God protected him through the battle. So Nehemiah gets back. He begins the construction of the wall, but not right off the bat. What Nehemiah did, he surveyed. He was a pragmatic man. He just didn't go in with guns blazing. He assessed the damage, came up with a plan, got his people together to execute the plan, and then he put the plan in action. And the plan began to work. But guess what? Let's look at a similarity between Ezra and Nehemiah. What do you think happened when Nehemiah began to build a wall? The friends, the neighbors began to come, and we're going to shut it. They shut the temple down. This is a half century later. Friends that should be supporting come. We're going to shut the wall down. Why? Because the rich people were raiding the poor. We want things to stay the way that they are so we can continue in power, and we don't want God to have the power. And then they try to get Nehemiah down, and as the scriptures say, Nehemiah says, I'm up here, I'm doing a great work, and I'm not coming down. So Nehemiah had to make a choice, whether we're going to depend on prayer and depend on God, or whether we're going to arm ourselves. what do you think the choice he made? He made both. They prayed and they armed themselves for battle. So they worked with a trowel in one hand and with a sword prepared to fight in the other. And that's just telling us we got to learn as Christians to stand fast for God, no matter what it takes. Prayer is fine, and we got to pray. That's our connection with God. But God requires action from us. We can't sit back. Like I say, God will fight our battles, but we're going to have to be in there throwing the fist. We can't sit back on the couch and fold our arms. And that's what we learn here. So Nehemiah prepared his people, and he accomplished the mission that God has set forth for him to accomplish. And he did not allow any distraction. But we got to be careful. Like I say, when you're doing don't get discouraged, because you may be doing a great work like Nehemiah, but don't get discouraged. Hang in there. God, if it's God's will will be accomplished, and it doesn't matter who try to stop you, where. But it's just so amazing how in both instances it was the enemy within. You had enemies outside, but it was the enemy within trying to stop the work of God. The walls were finished in 52 days, and Nehemiah had a commitment. After the 52-day completion, he went back to Persia. 12 years later, he returned. And guess what he found when he returned? I was saying the last lesson, we keep saying that song, Maybelline, why can't you be true? You keep doing the same old things you used to do. The people had backslid. Foreign marriages, not conducting the worship service. So Nehemiah had to come in and once again, like, wake up, people. We just getting out of captivity. You had priests and you had prophets, so he had worship service in essence. In fact, he had the priests read the decree, and he had them sign that they were going to obey the Lord. But he was saving them. See, sometimes people be petitioning and we think they be hard, but Nehemiah was saving them from doom again. You just got out of captivity, and Nehemiah is saying you don't want to go back there. Nehemiah realized through building that city, if you didn't have the walls, let's look at the city and the temple, just to compare. The temple we can consider a secular work, and the temple was sacred work. The wall was secular work. But God used them both together. Sometimes you couldn't use one without the other. The temple sitting there unprotected wouldn't have lasted too long. So both had a purpose, and God used two people to accomplish his purpose. The temple with its rich decorations wouldn't have lasted too long because people would have cleaned it out. So let's read the prayer of Nehemiah in 1 and 11, chapter 1, verse 11. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and the prayer of your servant who delights in revering your name. Give your servant success in granting him favor in the presence of this man that I was cupbearer. So Nehemiah started out praying and wanted to be close to the Lord, and the Lord honored his prayer. As we close out, our third book is the book of Esther. Esther consists of 10 chapters, and Esther talks about God's providence and his presence controlling the circumstances of our life and during the captivity they were in Judah. Esther was written during the period of captivity, and it is a short story similar to the book of Ruth, starting in the palace of Shushan, Susa, as some might say, one of the three capitals of the Persian Empire. Esther's true name was Hadassah, and she was an orphan Jewish girl who was also called Esther, and she was entrusted to a Jewish relative to raise her. That relative's name was Mordecai, who was a political activist, and he was a gatekeeper for the king. The king of Persia at that time was King Xerxes, and King Xerxes became offended with one of his queens, Vashti, and he wanted to replace her. So at that time, what Mordecai did, he convinced Esther to offer herself to the service of the king. And as a result of that, the king made Esther his queen. And there was one of the king's servants named Haman, who was a minister to the Persian king. He was plotting against the Jewish people. He wanted to eradicate the entire race. So what Esther did, she put her life at risk as she planned to save the Jewish people. She arranged a banquet, requested that the king attend the banquet, and then she revealed many things about the wickedness of Haman and the righteousness of Mordecai. So she became a spokesman for her relative and then a spokesperson against Haman, who was trying to kill her people. And as a result, the king got annoyed with Haman, and he did away with Haman, and that's how she saved her people. But what we need to look at is the sacrifice that Esther made. She became a part of a harem to be queen. She had to give up her life outside of royalty. She had to give up her virginity because one of the requirements was she was supposed to spend one night with the king, in other words, so he could test her out. But she was a beautiful woman, and the king was fascinated by her beauty, and she got where she needed to be, where God needed her to be, so that he could accomplish his purpose. Because without Esther being there, Haman would have eradicated the entire race. The book of Esther is a literary masterpiece that reveals much about God, though God is mysteriously omitted from the book. As we mentioned, the name of God is not mentioned in the book of Esther, but you can see God all through the book. It was read at the feast of what we call Purim, and this is just a ceremony that celebrates the great deliverance of the Jewish nation brought about through Esther, and Jews today still read that book. In summary, the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther have several common features. All three are relatively short narratives about events happening during the reign of the Persian Empire. All three involve Persian kings and other government officials. All three focus on activities of Jews who are seeking to thrive in an environment that is in many ways hostile and lack of exercise their faith in God. All three books bear witness to the fact that a Persian king could be helpful to the Jews in their effort to survive and thrive. It took outside interference, and God ran that interference. All three feature key leaders whose actions are held up as model of imitations. Ezra did what God required him to do. Nehemiah did what God required him to do. And Esther did what God required her to do. All three feature key leaders whose actions are held up. All three books show people at work, thus providing an opportunity to reflect upon how these books impact our understanding of work and its relationship to God. God provided the work in the background. He worked on the heart of men, but people had to use their bodies, physical bodies, to accomplish what God wants to. God has a part to play. We have a part to play. God is involved in the lives of all the people, not only the chosen one. We could say Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther were part of God's chosen people. But God was also working in the life of Cyrus, Artaxerxes, and Xerxes. So God was working in the lives of those pagans to accomplish his will. God moves in the heart of the pagan kings, leading them to support his purpose. They didn't know what they were doing, but God knew. God was in control of the situation. The Lord inspires his people to devote their work to him, using a wide variety of strong leaders and prophetic voices to fulfill his purpose. In Ezra, God used a faithful priest to rebuild his temple. In Nehemiah, God used a lay person to rebuild the walls around the capital. And in Esther, God uses deeply compromised, initially unobservant Jew to save the Jewish people from genocide. From the perspective of all three books, God is at work throughout the world, making use of work of all kinds of people. I hope you enjoy this lesson as much as I've enjoyed getting through it. I hope that God will keep us all safe during this pandemic. I pray for our church. I pray for you, and I ask you to continue to pray for me. Thank you.